Hi, my name is Mark Stallard. Welcome to Little Green Man. This is part 2 in our 7-part series on the budget doctrine, which is more than about just balancing the budget, but it's where balancing the government budget will lead us and how good this is not for us. So to understand the balance of the budget lie is to understand what government debt is. Well, when governments need to borrow money, because income is less, so they're not bringing in enough money, when they need to borrow money, they sell bonds, and they sell bonds to private banks. These, of course, come with interest, that they'll sell the bond. When the bond matures, then they pay them the amount the bond was worth, plus interest. So it's very similar to a loan that you or I might take out for a car, or for the mortgage, or for a business, for that matter, might take out to increase, for whatever reason, business need to borrow money. They certainly do at the beginning. And so in that respect, you borrow money, you pay interest back. But the difference is these government bonds are guaranteed by the state bank. So that we don't have that luxury as citizens and government and corporations and businesses don't have that luxury either, but governments do. So if you were to buy government bonds, you'd be guaranteed the interest at the end of it, regardless of how any market performs. So if inflation goes through the floor, then this would be guaranteed that they would have a relatively high interest rate. So it'll be guaranteed. Now, as a sidebar, this is important to know this before we move on. The private banks that lend the money to governments are actually privately owned by the same corporate network that owns all the other businesses. So these are private banks run by rich people, and many of these rich people will have their fingers in many other pies. But these people are the same people that we're hearing about who aren't paying a full amount of taxes. They get all these special loopholes thrown in. Into the law. They've gone out of their way to ensure that the corporate loopholes are in the tax law so they can pay as little as possible. And there are offshore ways of hiding the money, and not going to go into that right now. But they're not paying their taxes, and we know they're not, and it's a big deal right across North America for sure, and right across Europe as well. So they're not paying their taxes. And so what we're doing by taking government bonds, and so rather than taking these bonds and borrowing money from the state bank, borrowing money from private companies, is effectively saying that these taxes that you're not going to pay, you can give us those taxes, and then after the bonds mature, we'll give you back the same taxes you should have paid, plus we're going to give you a bit of interest. That's how it works. So it's kind of despicable in that respect. So how is government debt different from private debt? Well, actually, it's at a very high level, it's the same. I need money for a particular purpose, so I go to a bank, borrow the money, and I pay back interest. But that's kind of where it really stops being the same, because the government debt and private debt, and for that matter, private and business debt, is handled completely differently from government debt. Now, we'll look at this from a family's point of view. It'll be a little easier to understand when you borrow money from a bank to buy a car, or maybe renewing your mortgage or whatever, that the higher your income is, the less of the interest rate you're likely to get, because you're more likely to pay off that debt quicker. So you get a good or a high credit rating. And if you lose your job and you're renewing your mortgage, say for instance, the chances are you might have to pay a higher interest rate if they'll even cover that. You certainly won't be. If your credit rating is too low, then you won't be able to get a loan. You won't be able to buy a car, for instance. So that's how it works, and you've all experienced that, and that's very similar to how it works in business as well. But government is completely and utterly different. So when government raises revenue, so when it increases its income, when it raises taxes, its credit rating, instead of going up, because those loans there's no chance or a little chance that they're going to default on those loans, their credit rating actually goes down. It's the absolute opposite of what it is for a private or a business debt. Now, which is curious, so that when they raise taxes, their credit rating goes down and the interest goes up. So the private companies that are lending the money to the government get more money in return, which is kind of odd, which is the opposite way for me, you businesses. So why is that? Well, the reason for this is, and it's really quite simple, there are three main credit rating agencies that decide on the credit rating for governments. And these are privately owned companies, part of the same corporate network that own the banks, that own the corporations that are not paying, and the other corporations that are not paying their taxes, and that are benefiting, many of them benefiting from these government bonds. So when that happens, so they ensure that when those, if they were to raise taxes, so that helps them to, they get the more interest, that encourages them to keep the taxes lower, so that, at least lower for corporations and the rich people own them. But in the end, you end up paying the debt, more of the debt, so that they can get profit on not paying their taxes. So this is really weird that it is kind of funny that we've got to this point. And you're probably asking yourself this question already, is why then do the people that are pushing for balancing the budget, particularly as the right wing are supportive of businesses and corporations and the rich people that own them, why do they hate debt? Well, I'm going to address that in the next video in part 3. So why do corporations hate debt? Why do neoliberals hate debt? Well, that's coming up. See you in part 3.